She was floating in the center of my private pool on a giant inflatable flamingo, holding a diet soda, wearing orthopedic sandals, and telling me, with a completely straight face, that she was conducting a mandatory community usability test on water I pay the mortgage for. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her, nodded slowly, and went back inside. My name is Mark. I'm a network engineer, and I spent $40,000 building a backyard nobody was ever supposed to see but me. But when someone decides that your private property is their personal amenity, asking nicely doesn't work. Neither does a padlock, as it turns out. She brought a portable refrigerator, a floating tray of snacks, and enough confidence to last a lifetime. I brought 52 snakes. By 2:15 that afternoon, she had none of the above, and the entire HOA board had a front row seat to every second of it. The water in my pool had this perfect glass-like stillness to it. It was early June, right around 7 in the morning, and the world hadn't figured out it was supposed to be hot yet. I was sitting on my patio with a mug of black coffee, just listening to the hum of the filter. It was the kind of peace you sign a 30-year mortgage for. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and 40,000 gallons of chlorinated sanctuary perfectly enclosed behind a 6-foot privacy fence. Then came the sound. Smack, 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 smack. It was the unmistakable rhythm of cork-soled orthopedic sandals hitting concrete. I didn't even have to look up to know who it was. The gate latch clicked, groaned, and swung open. "You really need to oil that hinge," a voice said. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I set the mug down on the glass table. Then I turned my head. There she was. Brenda. Brenda was the vice president of the Neighborhood Homeowners Association. She was wearing beige capri, a wide-brimmed sun visor that was wider than her shoulders, making her look like a deeply unhappy mushroom, and she was holding a neon pink tablet pressed to her chest, as if it were a shield protecting her from the consequences of her own actions. She looked at me like I was a tax audit she hadn't prepared for. "Good morning, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. "You are in my backyard." "I am conducting a perimeter compliance check," she said, tapping a manicured fingernail against her clipboard. "And I noticed your pool pump is running outside of the designated noise ordinance hours." "The noise ordinance ends at 6 in the morning," I said. "It is 7:15. Also, this is a private backyard. The association retains the right to inspect all exterior water features to ensure they aren't breeding grounds for mosquitoes," Brenda said, stepping closer to the edge of the water. She leaned over, squinting at my pristine, crystal-clear pool. "Your pH looks a little high." "You can't see pH with your bare eyes, Brenda." "I have a very good sense for these things," she said, entirely unbothered by logic. "I'll be coming back tomorrow afternoon to take a sample. Please make sure the gate is unlocked." "If you come into my yard tomorrow, I am calling the police," I said. I said it quietly. I didn't yell. I didn't stand up. I just looked at her. Brenda's eyes narrowed. She adjusted her visor. "We'll see what the board has to say about hostility toward an officer of the community," she snapped. She turned around, her sandals smacking against the concrete all the way back out the gate. She didn't close it behind her. I walked over, pushed the gate shut, and slid the deadbolt into place. I honestly thought that was the end of it. I thought it was just a typical power trip from someone who had way too much free time and not enough actual authority. I was wrong. 3 days later, I came home early from work. It was supposed to be a half day. I was exhausted, sweating through my button-down shirt, and all I wanted was to strip down to my trunks and float on my back for an hour. I walked through the house, slid open the glass back door, and stopped dead in my tracks. There was a giant inflatable pink flamingo floating in the middle of my pool, and lounging right in the center of it, wearing a pair of enormous black sunglasses and holding a can of diet soda, was Brenda. I stood there for a full 10 seconds. I didn't blink. I just stared at the absurdity of it. The flamingo bobbed gently in the current. "You got a lot of chlorine in this water," Brenda said loudly, not even turning her head to look at me. It's drying out my skin. Brenda, I said, my voice dangerously soft. What are you doing? I am exercising my right to neighborhood amenities, she said, taking a sip of her soda. This is not a neighborhood amenity, I said, stepping right up to the edge of the pool. This is my house. I bought it. I pay the property taxes. I pay for the water. Get out. According to the revised community bylaws, paragraph 4, section 9, she recited, swirling the ice in her can, any water feature exceeding 10,000 gallons is classified as a community reservoir in the event of an emergency. As an HOA board member, I am required to perform routine usability tests. There is no emergency, I said, and you are floating on a plastic bird. It's a usability test, she insisted, finally pulling her sunglasses down to glare at me. And frankly, I find your tone very aggressive. I'm going to have to write you up for a community standards violation. If you've ever had someone look you dead in the eye and tell you they own something you pay the mortgage on, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps me know I'm not the only one dealing with this specific brand of crazy. Get out of my pool, Brenda, now. I will be out in 15 minutes, she said, pushing the sunglasses back up. My legs are cramping. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just turned around, walked to the pool equipment pad by the side of the house, and opened the breaker box. I flipped the main power switch for the pool heater. Then, I cranked the chilling function on the heat pump to its maximum setting. The water was currently sitting at a comfortable 82 degrees. Within 10 minutes, it was going to feel like a mountain stream in late November. I walked back inside, made myself a sandwich, and stood by the kitchen window. Next door, my neighbor Dave was standing on his back porch. Dave was a retired mechanic who moved precisely at half the speed of a normal human. He was leaning against his wooden fence, holding a mug of black coffee, watching my pool with mild interest. I watched Brenda. 5 minutes passed. She shifted uncomfortably on the flamingo. She dipped her hand into the water and quickly pulled it back out. 7 minutes passed. She shivered. 10 minutes passed, and she scrambled off that floaty like it had caught fire, splashing into the shallow end and practically sprinting up the stairs. She was covered in goosebumps, wrapping her floral towel tightly around her shoulders. She stomped toward the gate, but not before shooting a venomous glare at my kitchen window. Dave raised his coffee mug to her as she walked by. She ignored him. The next morning, I drove down to the local hardware store and bought a heavy-duty stainless steel padlock and a thick iron chain. I wrapped it around the wooden posts of my backyard gate, clicked the lock shut, and pocketed the key. I figured a physical barrier would solve the problem. That was my mistake. I applied normal human logic to a homeowners association board member. 2 days later, I was sitting on my patio reading a book when there was a loud knock on the wooden fence. Not a polite knock, a demand. "Open this gate immediately," Brenda's voice shrilled through the wood. "No," I said loudly, not even looking up from my book. "I have the fire marshal with me," she yelled. "You are in violation of county safety codes." I closed my book. I sighed. I walked over and unlocked the gate, swinging it open. Standing there was Brenda, clutching her pink clipboard, and next to her was a guy in a dark blue uniform. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had been dealing with people like Brenda for 30 years and was desperately counting the days until his pension kicked in. "Hi," I said. "Can I help you?" "Are you the homeowner?" the marshal asked. His name tag read, "Mike." "I am." "Mike, tell him," Brenda demanded, pointing a rigid finger at my chain. "Tell him about the hazard." Mike let out a long, slow breath. "Look, buddy, I'm sorry to bother you, but technically, under County Ordinance 412, gates providing access to the rear of a residential property cannot be secured with a secondary, non-integrated locking mechanism if there is a body of water present. It's an emergency access rule." "It's my private backyard," I said. "I know," Mike said, looking at me with eyes that begged me not to argue with him. "But if a kid falls in, or if there's a fire back here, emergency services need to be able to kick the latch open. A heavy iron chain prevents that. You have to remove it. It's a severe hazard, Brenda chimed in, her voice dripping with absolute triumph. We take safety very seriously in this neighborhood. I expect that chain gone by noon. I looked at Brenda. She was practically vibrating with smugness. She had that specific little smile people get when they use the rules to bully someone and know they can get away with it. And if I don't remove it, I asked Mike. I have to write you a citation for $500, Mike said softly, and she'll just keep calling me every day until I do. He will, Brenda said brightly. I looked at the chain. I looked at Mike. I looked at Brenda's orthopedic sandals. All right, I said. I pulled the key from my pocket, unlocked the padlock, and let the heavy chain drop to the concrete with a loud clang. There, the hazard is removed. Thank you, Mike said, instantly turning around and walking toward his truck. He didn't want to be there a second longer than he had to be. Brenda lingered. She stepped right into the threshold of the gate, placing one foot on my property. I'll be doing my usability test on Saturday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she said, her smile growing even wider. Don't bother trying to chill the water again. I know how to use a breaker box. She turned and walked away. I stood there for a long time. I looked at the gate. I looked at the pool. The water was perfectly calm. I walked over to the fence dividing my yard from Dave's. Dave was out there, pulling weeds from his tomato plants. He didn't even look up as he spoke. She beat you on a technicality, Dave said, tossing a handful of weeds into a bucket. She did, I said. You gonna let her swim in your pool? No, Dave, I don't think I am. Good, Dave said, finally standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. Because she leaves empty soda cans on your patio table, and it really bothers me. I walked back inside and sat down at my computer. I didn't need a padlock. I didn't need a chain. If Brenda wanted to use my pool, I just needed to make sure she never, ever wanted to use it again. I spent 3 hours researching. I went down a deep rabbit hole of practical jokes, theatrical props, and wildlife deterrence. I needed something harmless, legal, and absolutely terrifying. I found exactly what I was looking for on a specialty film prop website. They were called articulated silicone water mimics. To a normal person, they were just rubber snakes, but these were not the cheap, stiff plastic toys you buy at a dollar store. These were 3-foot-long, hyper-realistic replicas of the northern water snake. They had a weighted head, a segmented silicone body, and a buoyancy chamber in the middle. When dropped in still water, they floated just beneath the surface. But when the water moved, when there was a current, the segmented bodies caught the flow of the water and made them slither. They looked entirely, horrifyingly alive. They were expensive. I didn't care. I bought 52 of them. The box arrived 3 days later. I carried it into the backyard and opened it on the patio table. Dave was leaning over the fence. "What's in the box?" he asked. I reached in and pulled one out by the tail. It draped over my hand, the silicone scales catching the sunlight, the jointed body swaying naturally in the breeze. Dave dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on his wooden deck. "Good Lord," Dave breathed. "Put that away." "It's fake," I said, tossing it onto the concrete. It landed with a wet, heavy smack. "I don't care," Dave said, taking a step back from his own fence. "That is an abomination. What are you doing with those?" "Brenda is coming for a usability test tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon, I said. "I'm just making sure the environment is stimulating." Setting the trap required a little bit of engineering. The problem wasn't getting the snakes into the pool. The problem was keeping them hidden until the exact right moment. My pool has an automatic cleaning system. It's a little robotic vacuum on wheels with a long, thick-ribbed hose that connects to a dedicated suction port on the side of the pool wall. When the pump timer kicks on, water pressure drives the vacuum, making it crawl around the bottom of the pool while the hose whips around the surface. I gathered all 52 snakes. I stuffed them into a large, dark green mesh laundry bag. I walked over to the deep end of the pool, right where the diving board hung over the water. The diving board had a thick, hollow fiberglass base. I wedged the mesh bag tight up underneath the base, completely out of sight from anyone standing on the deck. Then, I tied a slip knot using high-tension fishing line. I wrapped one end of the line around the drawstring of the mesh bag. I ran the other end down into the water and tied it securely to the middle of the automatic pool cleaner's hose. Here was the plan. The pool pump was connected to a digital timer on the side of the house. I set the timer for exactly 2:15 in the afternoon. When the clock hit 2:15, the main pump would kick on. The water pressure would flood the lines. The automatic cleaner would jerk forward to start its cycle. When the hose moved, it would yank the fishing line. The slip knot would pop open. The mesh bag would drop into the water, untie itself, and release 52 hyper-realistic, fully articulated water snakes directly into the high-pressure return jets at the deep end of the pool. The jets would catch them immediately, sending all 52 snakes writhing and slithering across the surface of the water straight toward the shallow end. I tested it twice that evening. Both times, it worked flawlessly. The visual effect of 50 fake snakes aggressively swimming toward the stairs was enough to make my own heart rate spike, and I was the one who built the trap. The snag happened the next morning. I was doing a final inspection of the fishing line when the gate swung open. It was only 10 in the morning. Brenda wasn't supposed to be here until 2. "Just doing a preliminary walkthrough," Brenda announced loudly, striding onto the patio. She was wearing a bright yellow floral swimsuit under a sheer white cover-up. She had her clipboard. My heart dropped into my stomach. The mesh bag was hidden, but the fishing line was stretched tight from the diving board down into the water. If she looked closely, she would see it. If she touched the pool hose, she would trigger the slip knot early. "You're early," I said, standing up quickly and moving to block her line of sight toward the diving board. "The board requires randomized inspections to ensure compliance is maintained at all hours," she said, tapping her pen. She walked right to the edge of the water, looking down at the automatic cleaner hose. She leaned over. She reached her hand out toward the water. "Don't touch that," I said sharply. She paused, looking up at me with a triumphant little smirk. "Is the homeowner giving orders to an inspector?" "It's highly pressurized," I lied, keeping my voice entirely flat. "If you pull the hose while the system is primed, it could blow the O-ring on the filter manifold. That's a $3,000 repair, Brenda. And since you are acting as an agent of the HOA, the association would be liable for the property damage." Brenda's hand stopped an inch from the water. She blinked. The threat of financial liability was the only language she actually respected. She pulled her hand back and stood up straight, smoothing her cover-up. "Well, just make sure the surface is skimmed by 2. I'll be back." She turned and marched out, leaving the gate wide open. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I walked over, checked the knot one last time, and went inside to wait. If you are ready to see exactly what happens when a neighborhood tyrant meets 52 pieces of highly articulated silicone, drop a comment below and let me know how you would have handled this. Because things are about to get really wet and really loud. At 1:45, Dave came out onto his back porch. He had brought out a folding lawn chair. He set it up right next to the fence, sat down, and opened a fresh can of beer. He didn't say a word to me. He just nodded. At 1:55, the gate latch clicked. Brenda walked in. She had brought a rolling cooler. She had brought a thick plush towel. She had brought a floating tray designed to hold snacks and drinks in the water. She looked like she was moving in for the weekend. I was sitting at my patio table pretending to read the same page of a magazine over and over again. "I see you left the gate unlocked," she said. "Very compliant." "Have a great swim, Brenda," I said, not looking up. She huffed, dragged her cooler to a lounge chair, and began unpacking. She laid out her towel. She took off her cover-up. She adjusted her visor. She placed a can of diet soda and a small plastic bowl of pretzels onto her floating tray. Then, she walked down the stairs into the shallow end of the pool. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief as the water hit her waist. She pushed the flamingo out of her way, set her floating tray in front of her, and leaned back against the submerged steps, closing her eyes and tilting her visor up toward the sun. It was 2:00. I sat completely still. Over by the fence, Dave took a slow sip of his beer. The neighborhood was incredibly quiet. The only sound was the gentle slosh of the water against the tiles as Brenda shifted her weight. She reached out, grabbed a pretzel from her tray, and popped it into her mouth. She looked entirely at peace. She looked like a woman who had successfully conquered a small piece of the world and was enjoying the spoils. 2:10. Brenda began humming a song. It was slightly off-key. 2:14. I closed my magazine. I folded my hands on the table. 2:15. From the side of the house, the electrical relay on the timer box clicked. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet yard. A heavy mechanical hum vibrated through the concrete as the 2-horsepower pump roared to life. The water in the pool instantly began to circulate. At the bottom of the deep end, the automatic cleaner shuddered. The pressure built up in the line. The robotic wheels gripped the plaster. It jerked forward abruptly. The hose whipped across the surface of the water. The fishing line snapped taut. Underneath the diving board, the slip knot released with a soft, almost imperceptible pop. The heavy green mesh bag dropped straight down into the water. For about 3 seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The bag sank slightly, catching the flow of the high-pressure return jet located right beneath the board. Then, the bag opened. 52 hyper-realistic segmented silicone snakes spilled out into the current. The return jet caught them perfectly. It blasted them forward, sending a massive, writhing, tangled ball of artificial reptiles shooting across the surface of the pool straight toward the shallow end. The water flow made their segmented bodies whip back and forth. They weren't just floating, they were slithering. They looked like a coordinated swarm of angry wildlife charging a target. Brenda had her eyes closed. The leading edge of the snake swarm hit her floating snack tray. It bumped against her chest. Brenda opened her eyes. She looked down. Draped across her diet soda, resting on her collarbone, and completely surrounding her in the water, were over 50 perfectly detailed water snakes, all writhing in the churning current of the pool jets. The sound that came out of Brenda's mouth did not sound human. It was a high-pitched, vibrating shriek that started in her lungs and tore through the neighborhood like an air raid siren. "Snakes!" she screamed. "Oh my God, snakes!" She panicked. Total, absolute panic. She tried to stand up, but her foot slipped on the submerged step. She went down hard, plunging underwater right into the middle of the swarm. She came up gasping, spitting pool water, her visor completely sideways, blinding her. She was thrashing her arms wildly, sending pretzels and diet soda flying across the deck. She grabbed the plastic flamingo for leverage, but the flamingo flipped over, dunking her again. "Help me!" she shrieked, kicking wildly. "They're biting me! They're everywhere!" She finally found her footing on the top step. She lunged forward out of the water, completely abandoning all dignity. But her wet orthopedic sandal hit the slick concrete deck. Her foot slid out from under her. Brenda went airborne. She flew forward, her arms pinwheeling in the air, and she face-planted directly onto the wet concrete. She slid for about 3 feet, colliding heavily with her own rolling cooler. The cooler tipped over, dumping 10 pounds of cubed ice directly onto her back. She lay there on the concrete, gasping for air, clutching her knees to her chest, covered in ice and crushed pretzels, her visor hanging by a thread around her neck. I didn't move. I just sat at the patio table. Over by the fence, Dave slowly brought his hands together, clap, clap, clap. But Dave wasn't the only one watching, because it was 2:15 on a Saturday afternoon. And every single Saturday at 2:15, the HOA board president and the neighborhood safety committee took their weekly stroll down the sidewalk directly behind my house. My back gate was still wide open. Standing right in the opening of the gate, frozen in absolute shock, was the HOA president, a tall man named Richard, along with 3 other board members. They had a perfectly clear view of the entire disaster. They saw Brenda, the vice president of compliance, dripping wet, covered in ice, sobbing on the concrete of a private citizen's patio. They saw the giant flamingo. They saw the diet soda bleeding into the pool. And they saw 52 highly realistic silicone snakes lazily circling the shallow end. Richard stared at Brenda. Brenda looked up from the concrete, coughing up a small amount of pool water, and saw Richard. Nobody spoke. The silence was heavier than the heat. "Brenda," Richard said slowly, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "What are you doing on this man's property?" "Snakes," Brenda whimpered, pointing a shaking finger at the water. "He has an infestation. It's a hazard." Richard looked at the pool. He stepped out of the gate, walked to the edge of the water, and stared down. The current slowly pushed one of the silicone snakes against the stairs. It bumped harmlessly against the tile. Richard leaned down, picked it up by the tail, and held it up in the air. "Brenda," Richard said, staring at the rubber toy in his hand, "this is a piece of plastic." Brenda froze. The realization hit her like a freight train. She looked at the snake in Richard's hand. She looked at the swarm still floating in the pool. Then she slowly turned her head and looked at me. I picked up my coffee mug, raised it slightly in her direction, and took a sip. It was cold. It still tasted amazing. "He set a trap," she yelled, her voice cracking as she scrambled to her knees, slipping slightly on a wet pretzel. "He attacked me. I'm an officer of the board." "You are trespassing," I said calmly, looking directly at Richard. "She has repeatedly entered my locked backyard, utilized my private property, and harassed me under the guise of an HOA usability test. I have asked her to leave multiple times. Today, I was simply cleaning my pool toys when she decided to invite herself in for a swim and slipped." Richard let out a long sigh. He dropped the rubber snake back into the water. He looked at Brenda, who was now desperately trying to fix her visor while sitting in a puddle of melted ice. "Brenda," Richard said, rubbing his temples, "go home." "But the hazard—" "Go home, Brenda," Richard snapped, raising his voice for the first time. "You are off the committee. We will discuss your resignation from the board at the emergency meeting tonight. Grab your things and get out of this man's yard before he presses charges for trespassing." Brenda didn't argue. She couldn't. Her supreme authority had just been dismantled in front of an audience of her peers. She stood up, shivering violently. She didn't bother to grab her cooler. She didn't grab the floating tray. She just wrapped her arms around herself, lowered her head, and walked past Richard, her wet sandals squelching loudly on the concrete. Squelch, squelch, squelch. She walked out the gate and disappeared down the sidewalk. The board members quickly followed her out, awkwardly refusing to make eye contact with me. Richard lingered for a second. He looked at the pool, then at me. "Sorry about the mess," Richard said. "I'll have it cleaned up by 3, I replied. Richard nodded, pulled the gate shut, and I heard the latch click into place. It was quiet again. I stood up, grabbed my pool skimmer net, and started fishing the snakes out of the water one by one. It took about 20 minutes. Dave was still sitting by the fence. He finished his beer, crushed the can in his hand, and leaned forward. "You know," Dave said thoughtfully, "I think that was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "Thanks, Dave. You going to keep the snakes?" "I think I'll leave one on the patio table," I said, "just as a decorative piece." Dave nodded in approval, picked up his lawn chair, and walked back inside his house. I didn't hear from Brenda the next day, or the day after that. A week later, I received a formal letter in the mail from the Homeowners Association. It was an apology letter from Richard, officially stating that the board had no jurisdiction over private backyard pools and confirming that Brenda was no longer associated with any neighborhood committees. 2 weeks after that, a for sale sign went up in Brenda's front yard. Apparently, the embarrassment of facing the neighborhood at the weekly block party was too much to handle. I never saw her again. I walked out to my backyard on a Sunday morning. The sun was just starting to warm the concrete. The pool water was perfectly still, a giant rectangle of untouched blue glass. I sat down in my patio chair, set my mug of hot coffee on the table, and leaned back. There were no clipboards. There were no orthopedic sandals. There was only the gentle mechanical hum of the pool filter doing exactly what it was supposed to do. I took a sip of my coffee, looked out over the water, and smiled.